technical difficulties.
Sorry, guys. Oh, it is on.
Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny. A little background about me. I was an English major in college focused on journalism, and while I did not pursue journalism, I never lost my curiosity or my love of constructing narratives, which led me to advertising, where I stayed for around 5 years. Now I do something called cultural intelligence, which is understanding the hidden roots of culture and connecting them to brand stories.
Cool. And my name is Anastasia, and before my current work in cultural research, insight, and brand strategy, I spent about 10 years in academia, as well as deeply immersed in social justice movements as an activist. And during that time, I finished my PhD in cultural studies, and I specialized in Black studies and Black feminist theory, which is another way to say that I spent many years thinking about the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality in our culture. And now I work with brands to tell culturally compelling and inclusive stories.
Yeah, so fun fact, Anastasia and I met on LinkedIn, and this is actually our very first time meeting in person. Yay. So we started talking about our interests and our work, and we realized we had a lot of similar interests. There was a lot of overlap in very different contexts. So I'm good at finding patterns in publicly available data and pop culture phenomena and using that to tell stories, and Anastasia has both access to very specialized academic theory and this very broad intersectional perspective of culture. And so our interests kind of dovetailed really nicely, and we were kind of primed for a collaboration. And so we put together this deck. We were really interested in semiotics, which is the study of symbols and meaning, and particularly how those manifest in memes, and more broadly, where language and culture even come from.
And I think we really decided to dive into this research like the first time we met on Zoom, I think, and ended up taking 6 months to really think about memes and digital culture. And we are particularly interested in understanding memes as a functional mode of language, as well as tracing their evolution and the way in which memes are so embedded in our everyday lives, not only online, but offline. So we released this Google Slides document that we titled Out of Office, An Investigation of Memes, Meaning, and Linguistic Competence online and in real life. So it's available on Google Slides. Feel free to message us or come up to us after the talk to get the link. And today we're here to present a snippet of that research.
Yeah, so the idea for this deck actually came from a piece I wrote back in college called Meditations on Language, and it was all about the nuances of language like linguistic competence and linguistic relativity that are really crucial yet underrated parts of developing fluency when you're learning a language. So for all you non-linguists, linguistic competence is the unconscious understanding of the grammatical framework of a language. Yeah, so bet you didn't know you were getting a linguistics lesson today. But essentially what that means is when you're fluent in a language, you understand when it makes sense and when it doesn't make sense, but you can't necessarily articulate why it doesn't make sense. So we know, for example, that we rank adjectives in the order of opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose, but you probably don't even realize you're doing it. And this is why big red dog sounds correct and red big dog sounds incorrect. And this is also why some non-native speakers have trouble with idioms sometimes. So the famous linguist Noam Chomsky came up with the example of colorless green ideas sleep furiously as an example of linguistic competence, because we understand this as English. We know it's technically a correct sentence, but we know grammatically that it doesn't actually make any sense. And linguistic relativity is the thing that we were really interested in, because that's the idea that the language that you speak influences your perception of the world. And that's where the limits of my language mean the limits of my world comes from. So there's the Stanford psychologist who did a study on how gendered language shapes cognition. And so she asked native Spanish speakers and native German speakers to describe a metal key. And because the word key is feminine in Spanish and masculine in German, Spanish speakers described it as tiny, lovely, golden, intricate, and German speakers described it as hard, jagged, serrated, useful. So you can see how your perception of the exact same object is contingent upon the filters through which you're viewing it. So we spent the past couple of months thinking about how memes and language relate to one another and intersect with one another, because essentially memes are just an abstract form of language. And like any other language, it takes a certain amount of cultural competency and cultural context to understand.
And the idea of thinking about memes as language isn't quite new. In 2018, a South African scholar of linguistics, Lizandra Glunglich, came up with this idea that we can actually think of memes as speech acts. That's what she called memes, speech acts. And by that, Grundlich meant that essentially the principles of spoken communication that has a speaker and a receiver can actually apply to the way that we use memes. For example, using a GIF to express a particular emotion, to convey a particular message, maybe to cast a judgment on somewhere on Twitter, or to advance an argument, or perhaps even just to make a joke. There is a principle of spoken communication that is applied there in a sense that a speaker is addressing an audience, and the audience is able to receive that due to the cultural competence that Jenny talked about. But what has happened since 2018 and what has been so interesting to us is the evolution of memes. So from GIFs and, say, images with blocks of text, we are now actually seeing memes that are emoji sequences. We're also seeing users imitate each other's hand gestures, body movements, emotional expressions. So we are really seeing the way in which memes are constantly evolving. They're in constant movement. And if we look at the pleading face emoji used in conjunction with the fingers emoji, we know that that connotes shyness. You know, we don't have to say any words. You know, we don't even have to speak English to understand that. And more we are seeing the ways that emoji sequences like that are actually entering our everyday lexicon and our everyday language. So if you pull me aside and you ask how did it feel entering the stage, I might just say this, but I don't have to say anything to you. You will understand me without me even saying a word. So that means, that we can actually think about memes as penetrating our everyday communication, as being a language on its own. And as this Twitter user notes, we speak in internet. So that is just another testament to the way in which memes are we're no longer just tweeting them, we're texting them, but we're also using them in communication with one another every single day. Memes are part of our everyday language, increasingly so.
So this is not exactly new. Memes have always existed in one form or another, whether it's religious iconography or political slogans, but it's only recently that internet memes themselves have been these kind of cultural artifacts and been used as cultural currency. So in our deck, we talk a lot about modern memes and communication, and if I say it's the blank for me, a certain group of people are going to understand what I'm talking about. It's like saying roll tide when you meet somebody from the University of Alabama, or responding to peace be with you and also with your spirit. It's basically acknowledging that you understand the reference, and it's a way of relating to that person, and this is why brands have also started to use memes as well. So I think the most interesting thing about memes from a branding perspective is that we're seeing all of these brands try to participate in internet lingo and try to join the conversation to feel more human and more relatable, because to an extent we like that. We like seeing Wendy's and McDonald's Twitter accounts get in fights and clap back at people. And I was joking to a friend of mine that it should be called the uncanny Silicon Valley, because there is a certain amount of comfort that we have with personified brands. But if a brand is doing it incorrectly, if it's past the life cycle of a meme, like Callan was saying, then it can feel really weird. And we're also seeing brands attempt to create memes as well. And it should be noted, I've never seen a brand meme go viral in the way that it was intended to go viral. But it does raise the question of, is it really a meme? Because the point of memes is that they're democratic, they're an equalizer, and they represent the democratization of the internet. So if a meme is manufactured by a brand, does it really count? Is it the same thing, and does it carry the same weight?
So if we accept the premise that memes are speech acts, they're part of our language, we inevitably are left with the question of ethics of language, right? Through history, we know that language has been used to oppress people, to marginalize entire populations, whether by governments or by individual users. And that, for example, is the function of slurs. Slurs have functioned throughout history to strip people of their dignity and deny them human rights. But we have also seen words in language, words like queer, for example, be reclaimed by marginalized communities and owned by them. And so that leads us to the point that language isn't neutral. Language is not devoid of our social cultural realities. Language is not just fun. We're constantly implicated in decisions of what kind of language to use. So when it comes to meme culture, we may think about contemporary meme culture and specifically Gen Z culture. A lot of it draws and appropriates on Black and queer vernacular communication. And we just have to state that and name it. If you go online now and you look, something like Gen Z culture or Gen Z slang, you will see these viral, really popular articles that will say something, your guide to Gen Z slang. And they will include words like bet, bop, drip, finesse, that are framed as newness. The narrative around them is that of freshness and newness. These are new slangs that you need to understand Gen Z. But these words have actually been used by speakers of African American vernacular English in this country for years, even decades. And we have to seriously grapple with that. We can look at GIFs and research around how non-Black users use viral GIFs to express their emotions. And oftentimes, when it comes to extreme levels of emotions, white users as well as other non-Black users actually use GIFs featuring Black characters or Black people. So why that is, why are we engaging in these racialized digital behaviors? And the answer might be that we really need to wrestle with the history of racialization. We might begin by looking at the history of race in this country and certainly beyond, in which whiteness has been treated as a default, as the norm, oftentimes in Western epistemology associated with logic, with calmness. And Blackness has been historically constructed as excess, as that which exists outside of the norm, as that deviates outside of the norm. And we have also seen through history white people use anti-racist Black tropes to portray Black people as excessive, as loud, as aggressive, as emotionally uninhibited and difficult to control. We have to wrestle with that history because once we actually look at the racial history of the present, we can understand where these tropes that we are drawing on are coming from and their kind of cultural underpinning of our everyday practices. And none of this is to say that these user behaviors that I and we engage in are malicious or they're intentionally harmful. They're not. But if we are mindlessly engaging in any aspect of culture, and certainly in meme culture, we are very easily might slip into things like anti-Blackness, and that what Dr. Lauren Michelle Jackson called the digital blackface and digital minstrelsy. So all that is to say that if we think of memes as language, we also have to think about how we're using language and what actually drives these behaviors.
Yeah, so the cultural impact section of our deck talks a lot about the tangible way in which memes can actually move the needle on culture. And that can be how seemingly innocuous jokes on the internet become either central points of community or how they can cause real harm offline. But either way, they prove that the things we do on the internet don't exist in the vacuum. They are shaped by and are actively shaping our real lives. So for the most extreme example is in the Philippines. There's an article called Speaking in Fascism's Tongues, and it's about how martial law imposed in the Philippines under dictator Rodrigo Duterte has not only influenced everyday expressions by normalizing violence by calling a dish tortured pork chop, but also perception. So due to an aggressive anti-drug campaign by the Duterte administration, quote, some accept as a new normal that drug users deserve to die, their corpses thrown duct-taped into streets. And before you think that we're exempt from this, we see it in the US too. So language matters, and that's why Donald Trump's nicknames for Joe Biden, like Corrupt Joe or Quid Pro Joe or China Joe, seem ridiculous at first, but they can actually cause real harm and incite real violence. When repeated enough times, these things can stick in your brain and actually subtly radicalize you into believing in things like a stolen election. So memes inevitably are implicated in societal power structures, and it's really interesting to see as the internet becomes more and more inescapable how memes represent real, tangible power. And so they can give power to voiceless communities, they can be proxies for human relationships, and they can signal social ingratiation. But at the heart of it, the definition of revolution is the traditionally marginalized, upsetting existing power structures. So when the Me Too movement took off on the social media platform Weibo, several Chinese officials were implicated in accusations of sexual harassment and sexual assault, leading to China blocking all mentions of the Me Too movement on the platform. And so Chinese feminists, in response, used the rice bunny emojis, which are pronounced as Me Too, to evade censorship. So we can see how internet culture can often intersect with activism, especially as political engagement becomes increasingly digital.
So memes, just like language, can be used for bad or for good. And as Jenny mentioned, memes can be used to resist silencing. But also, memes can be used to bring silence issue to public's attention. In the last year and a half, we have heard the saying that we are living in a perpetual state of racism pandemic. In addition to police officers' violence against Black Americans, we are also seeing a lot more stories of ordinary white Americans policing Black social life in this country. And that looks like ordinary white people, and another mimetic form of communication, the word Karen, policing Black people in this country engaging in very everyday activities, like making barbecue or sleeping in a college dorm room. Common room. And what's interesting about that is that it's not that those things have not happened before. They have, and they're part of the history of this country. But it is ordinary digital users who use memes in order to draw attention to issues that have been neglected and ignored by the so-called justice system. And so we can see memes like This You or the Barbecue Becky and a gazillion of other iterations of this particular meme that have been acting as a kind of form of public accountability in a country where racist behaviors and ethically questionable behaviors, acts, and crimes actually have gone unpunished for so long. And so we are seeing activists actually using the power of the meme as a form of social sanctions, not only against brands, companies, and public figures, but also against people in our communities that are harming others around us. And so what's interesting to me, at least in that, is the way that we think about memes as, as tools in, social justice movements that are contesting the status quo, that are calling into question the norm, and are actually moving us towards futures worth believing in. And speaking about futures specifically, some of you might be surprised that as I speak, memes are actually considered to be part of our folklore. So there are archivists and librarians who are collecting memes as cultural artifacts. As I speak, the Library of Congress is already archiving web content and memes, as Jamie mentioned earlier, for future generations to study our culture in the same way that we turn to the past, to say medieval texts or ancient language, to understand societies that have come before us. So in that sense, it might be very useful for us to understand memes as speech acts, which kind of raises the question of personal responsibility in our own use of memes as language in interpersonal communications, as well as memes, those speech acts constituting a form of folklore of our time, in the same way that we are now thinking about things like folk music of the Appalachia. Those speech acts are cultural artifacts that are, in fact, our digital footprint and our cultural legacy. And so, final thought that we want to leave you with is that memes are funny and memes are fun, but just like language, memes are not purely entertainment. They're actually implicated in social structures of oppression, and it is our responsibility to grapple with these questions with a sense of critical honesty. So on that note, please meme responsibly.
Thank you, guys.